in theory, we understand how to select an element and what some styling looks like. And before going in and writing some CSS of our own and actually styling up a page, I wanted to take some time to explore this concept of the CSS box model. So the CSS box model. It's really important to have a good understanding of the CSS box model if you want to be able to write some effective CSS. And the way you can think of it is like this. Think about your HTML, and HTML has elements, right? And basically, in your HTML document, each element, you can kind of think of it as a sort of rectangular box, right? So each element in an HTML document, for example, um, can be thought of as a rectangular box. So, as a quick example, here is some HTML that I've written, and we have, for example, this. So inside this element, we have a paragraph element, right? And let's look at this entire element here. So on the rendered version, my cool site. So that would be this paragraph. And this element, think of it as being a box, right? So sort of a rectangular box. The browser has kind of laid it out, taking care of things like size, things like margin. Maybe there's some kind of padding between the content and the border, for example. And that's another thing that the browser does. It kind of interprets everything as sort of a box for us. And in CSS, basically each of these rectangular boxes is described using the standard box model is what it's called. Right, so the standard box model basically describes the space an element takes up, and each box has 4 edges. So there's basically the margin edge, margin, border, padding, and content edges. And so what I'm going to do next is I'm just going to paste in a visual representation of this box model that I've sort of created previously. Please excuse my amateur art here. And this is what pretty much every HTML element kind of looks like to the rendering engine, to the browser. So starting from the inside here, this is where your content will show up. So your content in here, you can have an explicit width and height set on it, but this could be, for example, your text inside of a paragraph, or your image, for example. So content stuff goes in here. And that's not the end of the story, right? Because we have this CSS box model, we have kind of the greater picture to think about. So not only is there content, but elements are also concerned with padding. And padding basically acts as padding. It's kind of in the name. So let's say you have some kind of background color set for your content. Right, so going back to our paragraph example, let's say your paragraph, you wanted to set the background color to red. Well, that would also extend out to the padding. Right, so it kind of adds extra space between the content and the next edge. It's kind of useful to think about the padding here as sort of extending the content. And by the way, if this is not making sense to you right now, I think it will start to make sense once we write some simple CSS. We'll kind of come back and take a look at this border or this box here after we've done so. In any case, so the padding, it sort of acts as an extension of the content in terms of, if you set a background color or some other aspect, you can just kind of increase the padding if you ever need more space between, say, the border and the content. That brings us to the next piece here, the border. Right, so there's padding, which would contain all this stuff, and then we have the border, which contains all of this stuff, essentially. And you can kind of think of this as extending the padding area to the edges of the border. And you can use this if you ever want to, for example, set a border around your element. You might be trying to set a border and you would expect it to go around here, but there's some padding you might need to consider. So that's something to be aware of as well. And again, we'll come back and take a look at this once we've kind of written some simple CSS. Then the final part of the box we need to know about is the margin. So think of the margin as sort of being sort of outside the box itself, in the fact that this is kind of used to set the space between one element and another. So what I mean by that is, let's say you have one element on top and then another element below, and you want to add a whole bunch of space in between. Well, what you could do is you could manipulate the margin on the top to add a whole bunch of space. You could manipulate the margin on the bottom of the previous element to do that as well. Same story if you have sort of two elements sitting next to each other on the page. You can set the margin to be greater or less, or set the same margin for both elements, and that'll affect kind of the space in between. So you can kind of think of this as kind of a divider, or a way to add in a separator. Right? So in other words, it separates this box from its neighbors. And this stuff is all pretty important to know when you are working with CSS to manipulate your layout. These things are things you need to know because, for example, the default settings are when you're setting the width, you might expect that to set only the content, but it might also be affecting your padding or your margin. So things to be aware of. And one other thing I wanted to show you is you can actually look up what the box kind of looks like in your CSS if you ever want to. So by default, this box model, it's always there, even if you don't explicitly target it or set it with CSS. And what I mean by that is let's do an inspection on this header element, for example. And you can do that quite easily if you're using Chrome. And all you need to do is kind of put your mouse in the area, right-click, and hit Inspect. And what's going to happen is Chrome will pop up a little tab or a window and taking you into the Chrome Dev Tools. All right, so I'm going to do that now. And we can see that it opened up this little panel down here. This is what's known as the Chrome Dev Tools. And this is a really useful feature when you're just starting out because you can kind of inspect any page, look at their source code, and kind of see how they did what they did. Right? You'll notice that this looks a lot like the HTML we wrote. Right? So for example, just to go back over here, it's kind of parsing it back out into HTML for us, right? So we can see, okay, that's what this looks like. Then we have a section, blah, 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 right? So it kind of breaks it out for us, makes it nice with little kind of drop downs. And really, we just need to know that you can do this in Chrome. And the thing I wanted to draw your attention to is this side over here on the right. So this is showing us the CSS, or the style that's being applied to this particular element. Right, notice that it's an H1, that's the selector. Then it has a bunch of these kind of default rules set. Right, we don't have any CSS currently on this project. Right, if I go to CSS, there's nothing there. Because the browser will automatically apply certain styles always. And what I wanted to show you is down here. Right, so this is a representation of the box that this element is a part of. Right, so it's telling us the dimensions, and we can see, okay, so here's our content, and wouldn't you know, this looks pretty similar to this box that I've created over here. Right, so we have our content, and when you hover over it with your mouse, it does kind of show you highlighted on the Chrome page up here. So we have this. It doesn't really have any padding on it. Notice that these values are all set to basically nothing. Border, it doesn't have any values set on it either, but there is a margin. So if I highlight this, notice that there's all this space between this H1, right? So there's this space here and this space above it. And that's because there's a margin. And just eyeballing it looks like it's about 21.440 pixels. It says it right there. And that is a way that this, the default styling applied to H1s, it just doesn't set any padding, doesn't tinker with the border, but it does set a certain margin. Right? So that's pretty cool. That's kind of maybe helps cement it in your mind a little bit more. And as you're kind of exploring the web, and if you see a cool layout, I would really encourage you to, if you're using Chrome, right-click, inspect. It's going to show you dev tools. There's a similar dev tools in Firefox and Safari. So whatever browser you're using, there's probably some pretty good dev tools implemented now. And we can do that with our image as well. So let's do it with this one. So I'll right-click on it, inspect. Okay, we can see that it's selected the image, and it's just showing us the dimensions of the image. There's not really any other styling applied. There's no margin, border, or padding. Right? These values are still there. They're just not being set explicitly by the browser. Right? Same thing with, say, these list items. Right? So let's take a look. Inspect. Okay, so we are on one list item here. Well, it has a width and height, but no explicit padding or margin. We can also just kind of grab out whatever element we want here if we click on it. And this time we can see that there is some kind of other CSS being applied, right? So the UL, the unordered list element that has a bunch of list items as children, the UL itself has certain properties set, right? Notice there's a margin on the top and bottom. Let me scroll down a bit. So there's a margin on the top and bottom, nothing to do with border, but padding. There's no padding on the top, right, or bottom, but there's about 40 pixels padding on the left. Right, so it's kind of increasing the space inside this element so that it kind of spaces in these bullet points. And then the content itself is set explicitly here with a height and width property. Right, so that's pretty neat, right? We can kind of get some glimpse of what the box model looks like. And, you know, again, if you're not quite getting it, I think once we start to write some CSS of our own, it's probably going to make a little bit more sense. But just did want to bring your attention to the fact that, you know, it is important to have an understanding of this box model, especially when it comes to setting things like padding and margin and understanding why your document looks the way it does when it comes to, you know, styling the CSS.